Good morning. Good morning. Congratulations to all of you for braving the weather. It's an honor today to welcome to our class Dr. Barbara Kellerman. Dr. Kellerman is one of the pioneers in the field of leadership, so a leader among leaders. She was the director of the Center for Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School for 3 years, between 2000 and 2003, and then for 3 years until now she has been the director of research. And you can see the combination of action and reflection, one of the main themes in our course. So both a leader in practice and a theoretician as well. Dr. Kellerman's book, Bad Leadership, which you're going to hear about today, has made a lot of waves in the field of leadership. You will understand why today. And she's working currently on 2 books. One is on followership, a topic that we will discuss in the coming weeks. And the second topic is women in leadership. A pioneer in the field, it's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Well, thank you very much, Tal, for inviting me. Am I too loud, not loud enough, or just perfect? Maybe I should leave right now, then. Well, I know Tal has this reputation, this wonderful reputation for talking about good and wonderful things. So I think he imported me here today to provide a corrective. Instead of hearing good and wonderful things, you're going to hear bad and dreadful things. The book Bad Leadership was written as a corrective, and I know you're getting a kind of primer this semester on leadership. So you're learning about it, but you'll have to take from me the assurance that of the gazillion books out there on leadership, a gazillion minus 1 or 2 or 3 are about good leadership. And having worked, as Tal said, in the field for some number of years, it dawned on me about 5, 6, 7 years ago that the field of leadership studies, which is sort of an academic field, was becoming, in my view, badly skewed toward the sunny side of the street. Now, the reasons for that are fairly complicated. Some of them are in the book. They entail stories of the human condition. It's in part about money and greed. It's in part about the nature of the academic marketplace. But when I started to think about this more seriously, I actually wrote a short little essay which I called Hitler's Ghost, a Manifesto. Now, the term Hitler's Ghost was meant to imply, number one, my view that Hitler, to take the extreme and often used example, was a leader. Even though some people would not define him as a leader, I find that not worthy of common sense. I find it not how we use the English language. We generally think of someone, in fact, in German, he was called the Führer, which means in English, the leader. So there was something counterintuitive about saying Hitler was not a leader. And I felt that the ghost of that bad, extremely bad leadership hung over the field of leadership studies in a way that deserved attention. And the term a manifesto was my desire actually to do something about it. So, as you see above you, bullet point number 1, this book is above all a desire to claim intellectually for the field of leadership studies the bad side, the stuff that goes wrong. I want to force us to look at the nature of the human condition, and I want to force us to do it in a way that enables us to begin to consider correctives. How the hell can we ever stop or even slow bad leadership if we are unwilling to seriously consider it? to look at it. That's the purpose of the book. Bullet point number 2. I wanted to look at what I sometimes call the universe of bad leadership. I did not want to focus on evil in particular, my Hitler's Ghost essay notwithstanding, because there had been so little done on bad leadership. There's just about, as I said, nothing out there. I wanted to look at bad leadership whole, and when I did, I found that bad leadership, as broadly defined, was divisible quite naturally and easily into 7 different types. And in fact, I will spend most of my time talking to you today about the 7 types. They range, as you will see, from incompetence at the sort of low end, minor end of bad leadership, although God knows incompetence can have lethal consequences. We know that, to what I call evil leadership. Bullet point number 3. As will have been implied from Tal's comments, I do not notice the book is not called Bad Leaders, even though we tend always to think in terms of individuals. And as implied in Tal's comments, I am as interested in followers as I am in leaders. So I talk about a web of leadership. The web of leadership has 3 strands, which are threaded throughout the book. Strand 1 is the leader. Strand 2 are the followers. And strand 3 is the context within which they are embedded. My argument, plain and simple, is that you cannot understand bad leadership, or indeed any kind of leadership, without taking into account all 3 of these threads. And by the way, implicitly the book suggests that bad leadership simply doesn't happen without bad followership. And at every turn, this is a theme that gets played out over and over again. By the way, you should know that I plan to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and we will have some time after that for discussion. I will not deal with the means and ends point in this presentation. It's just too short, but I do want to say a little bit about the ineffective and unethical divide. This hit me like a ton of bricks when I spoke maybe 10 years before an audience, and I was actually talking about Hitler. And I said something about Hitler being a bad leader, which to me was an absolutely unimpeachable sentence. And somebody, the words were barely out of my mouth when somebody in the audience, was seen protesting rather vigorously. And he said Hitler was not a bad leader. In fact, Hitler was a very good leader. And from his point of view, he's absolutely right. If you know anything at all about German history, you will know that between 1933 and 1939, at a minimum, Hitler was a brilliantly effective leader for the German people. And I learned then and there that when using terms as basic as good and bad, I'd better make clear if I am talking about ethics or if I'm talking about the level of effectiveness. Here, then, are the 7 types of bad leadership. Now, let me say a couple of things about typologies. First of all, they're not mutually exclusive. Now, I don't want to take any examples that mean anything, but let's pretend we were using a case in point of George Bush. One could argue that George Bush is in some ways incompetent. I'm not making that argument. I'm neutral here, but one could argue that, and one could argue that he's in some ways rigid. So it is not as if this typology is intended to suggest that human beings are never neat. We're complicated things. It is not intended to suggest that people fall neatly into these types, but it is intended to give you an idea of the ways in which leaders and their followers are, to use my generic term, bad. Let me go through each of the 7 types individually. Incompetent leadership. The leader and at least some followers. You'll notice that every one of these definitions includes at least some followers because you cannot do it alone. It never happens alone. lack the will or skill or both to sustain effective action with regard to at least one important leadership challenge, they do not create positive change. Now, the book, Bad Leadership, contains many different examples of bad leaders. But in order to drive home the case in point for each of the 7 different types, I chose a single case in point on which to focus in some detail. Does anyone in this room know who Juan Antonio Samaranch is? Yes. Correct, minus one little prefix, X. Chairman of the IOC, International Olympic Committee, a Spaniard who led the International Olympic Committee for over 2 decades. By the way, length of time as a leader is slightly correlated to bad leadership. It's often not so great to be in the same position for years on end. What did Juan Antonio Samaranch do? I should add about him, he was brilliantly competent in the early years of being the chair of the International Olympic Committee. But as he became entrenched in his office, as he surrounded himself, including the over 100-person member of the International Olympic Committee itself, with people who were, to a person, I use the phrase men advisedly, yes men, who did not contradict him or call him to account, over time the Olympic movement became corrupt, became awash in a sea of scandals, whether drugging or money laundering, a legacy that haunts it to this day. Rigid leadership. The leader and at least some followers are stiff and unyielding. Although they may be competent, they are unable or unwilling to adapt to new ideas, new information, or changing times. I'll ask the same question. Anyone know who this woman is? Sorry? Yes, we got it. Yes, exactly. Queen of the Internet. That's exactly what she was called. Mary Meeker was not a leader in any conventional sense of the term, but I use the term leader very broadly. What she was an opinion leader, and she was in particular an opinion leader on the stock market in the mid to late 1990s. So if she said, for example, buy Jeeves.com, hordes of investors in the stock market did what she said. She was so successful in her stock picking that she was, as one of your peers just said, labeled Queen of the Internet. However, this queen was rigid. This queen did not adapt to changing times, new information, and by the time the stock market tanked in 2000 or 2000 and 2001, in particular with regard to Internet stocks, she had not read the signals clearly. She stayed stuck where she was, and she was such an extreme example of a financial analyst and broker who was unwilling or unable to adapt to the changing times that she morphed from being labeled Queen of the Net to the poster child for the stock market bust or the breaking of the bubble, into the woman that you see here, can we ever trust Wall Street again? An example of rigid leadership. Intemperate leadership. The leader lacks self-control and is aided and abetted by followers who are unwilling or unable effectively to intervene. Now, I had so many examples from which to choose. The inability to control appetite, however appetite is defined, is quite common among leaders. And as I suggested in my comments, there are always followers around who are willing to support them no matter the misbehaviors. I ended up choosing this gentleman. More than a few of you, I think, will know who this is. Somebody? Anybody? The erstwhile, former, yeah, we got a couple of X's and formers and previous. Mayor of Washington, D.C., who had the interesting political trajectory of being elected 4 times over. Time 1 was understandable because he had been something of a civil rights hero. And indeed, the white population and the black population of the D.C. area were only too happy to welcome this promising, at that time, quite young man into their midst. The second election was less clear because it was already obvious that something was radically wrong with a man who, by the third election, by the third time he was elected, was famously addicted to what I sometimes, for the sake of economy, call sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This was not a secret. This was well known. And yet, for a variety of reasons, which we don't particularly have the time to go into, he was reelected for a 4th time. By then it was known that he was, as is commonly said, steering Washington into an abyss. And yet, he was reelected. In fact, this picture was taken only recently because this man, who is now not so young anymore and frail and has continued to be ill over the years, is still a favorite among Washingtonians and was recently elected about a year and a half ago, to the Washington City Council. Intemperate leadership. Callous leadership. The leader and at least some followers are uncaring or unkind. Ignored or discounted are the needs, wants, and wishes of most members of the group or organization, especially subordinates. How many of you have worked for callous leaders, experienced callous leaders? A couple. You're very young. You will. It's amazing how many leaders are not very nice. You know, not necessarily evil, but just not very nice. And here's an example. This is a man by the name of Al Dunlap, who looks like the quintessential image of the American CEO, which is exactly what Al Dunlap was. Al Dunlap was head of Scott Paper very successfully, made a ton of money not only for himself, but for stockholders of Stock Paper. And Al Dunlap then became, because of his success at Stock Paper, where he, by the way, was not very well loved, but he was very successful, he was made CEO of Sunbeam. The trouble with Al is that he was so mean and nasty, not only to those low down on the organizational ladder, but even to his closest subordinates, that he had a few monikers such as Rambo in pinstripes, Chainsaw Al, this being a more typical picture of Chainsaw Al, and became gradually quite notorious for being the most callous CEO in American business. Laid off huge numbers of people, frothed at the mouth when dealing with even his closest advisors, unable to control his rages and his furies. When you read the story of Chainsaw Al, and by the way, there is a very good book in paperback written about him by a man named John Byrne, you scratch your head and you say, how can this happen? How do people tolerate? What is it about us that allows people to get away with being so difficult, so mean, so nasty? This is actually my favorite picture of Al Dunlap because it was one of his favorite pictures of himself. And as you will see, this CEO, again, one of the richest and most successful in American business, although he ultimately had a downfall, liked the idea of being photographed with a black bandana around his head, with a large handgun in each of two hands, and with a leather strap across both sides of his chest with bullets presumably ready to go. Callous leadership. Corrupt leadership. The leader and at least some followers lie, cheat, or steal, to a degree that exceeds the norm. They put their own personal self-interest ahead of the public interest. And you'll notice I said to a degree that exceeds the norm, because I am assuming that all of us are, above all, self-interested. But in this case, it is above the norm. Now, again, a world of corrupt leaders from whom to choose. Who did I select to make a particular case in point? A man by the name of William Arimony. Is this name familiar to anybody here? The reason I chose Arimony is because he didn't just steal from sort of the public till. He was head of the United Way of America. Another guy who had been in office for 2 decades plus, and who decided toward the end of his 2 decades that it was a good idea to steal from the coffers of the United Way, which, as I said, is the nation's largest charity. And of course, if you're stealing from a charity, you are stealing from the poor and the sick and the needy. So this is a fairly egregious example of corruption. Again, there were followers involved. He was helped in helping himself by those to whom he was closest. Insular leadership. This is a category and a type, and you'll see in a minute when I bring up the person. By the way, you are not allowed to throw things at me, whatever your political leanings, when I bring this person up. It's usually open to some debate until I ask people why they imagine I categorize this person in this way. It's not a commonly thought of form of bad leadership, but I think it is quite bad. The leader and at least some followers minimize or disregard the health and welfare of the other, that is, of those outside the group or organization for which they are directly responsible. I said you're not allowed to throw things. Who would like to guess why I have this particular person categorized? In this instance, it's not as if these people are being painted with a broad brush, but this is an example of insular leadership. Let me go back to my definition of insular leadership. Does anybody want to guess why? Yes. Is your hand raised? Oh. Yes. Yes, exactly. I don't know if you all heard that. Rwanda. Under the watch of Bill Clinton, and I might add under the watch of UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, and under the watch of leaders from every country around the world. By the way, with their knowing about it, this is very amply documented. The administration knew about what was happening in Rwanda, as, by the way, did the Republican leadership in the House and Senate. So this is not particularly to single this president out. It is to draw attention to a kind of leadership that is so focused on the well-being of those for whom one is directly responsible that bad things happen sometimes to people outside, and we stand by and do nothing. We stand by and do nothing. It happens that the genocide in Rwanda, in which 800,000 people approximately died in approximately 4 months' time, is known to be the most efficient genocide, not the worst genocide, but in terms of numbers and the speed with which it happened, the most efficient genocide in human history. and the world stood by and let it happen. Subsequently, Bill Clinton came to regard his failure to do anything to try to intervene in Rwanda, preferably always when you're talking about a genocide, before the genocide begins, much easier then, as one of his greatest failures. And in 1998, toward the end of his second term in office, he offered this public apology in Rwanda itself. He delivered it in Rwanda itself, where he made in 1998 a brief stop. This was at the airport in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. For those of you who are interested in apologies and how they do or don't work, I might add a little note, which is that in the current issue of the Harvard Business Review, I have an article called "When Should a Leader Apologize and When Not?" So I've actually thought a lot about apologies rendered, and I wondered, I'm very glad this apology, I don't want to be misunderstood, I am very glad that Clinton made this apology. I think it was extremely important that he go on record as acknowledging the mistake. But there is a word in here that I don't much care for, and I wondered if any of you can figure out which word it might be. No one wants to guess? Yes. Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's the we word. In general, in life, when one wants to assume responsibility for something, and I think for leaders this might be particularly important, we need to say I. We need to say, I did not act quickly enough after the killings began. I did not, etc., etc., etc. Insular leadership. Evil leadership. The leader and at least some followers commit atrocities. They use pain as an instrument of power. The harm done to men, women, and children is severe rather than slight. The harm can be physical or psychological, or it can be both. Now, again, this is sometimes in the field of leadership studies a matter of semantics. Can we justifiably call an evil leader a leader, or should we have, does the word leader mean good people by definition? As far as I'm concerned, obviously no. To me, a leader is simply someone who leads or directs by any means possible other people to go along. And so I had a roster of evil leaders, some of whom are mentioned here, from which to choose: Saddam Hussein, whose name is known, of course, to all of you; Pol Pot, who presided over the Cambodian genocide; Jim Jones and David Koresh, both of whom I talk about somewhat in the book, who were cult leaders who ended up leading, as it were, their people to suicide. I focused on this man, Radovan Karadzic, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs in the early 1990s, a declared criminal by the World Court in The Hague, by the International World Court in The Hague. And what's interesting about this man, in a way some of these stories differ, so that what I regarded, for example, as most interesting about the Marion Barry case was not so much Marion Barry, but the followers, that is the electorate, that voted for this man 4 times over, even when it was so clear that something was going wrong. In this case, what's most interesting about the story is the man himself. Karadzic was a physician, a physician, psychiatrist, studied extensively in the United States, and also a published poet. In other words, sometimes we're faced with these existential questions in life. How does someone who is a healer, ostensibly physicians are healers, and a poet morph. And this guy morphed almost overnight into a murderous leader during the Balkan Wars. It is one of those rather unexplainable questions of human history. This photograph I include because it says something unexplainable about the rest of us. You see before you the same man, of course, with a striped wool cardigan, looking quite comfortable on a couch, reclining, and with a baby on his belly. The baby happens to be his grandchild. Now, what's interesting about this picture, and the reason I include it, is not, in this case, not what it says about him, but what it says about the rest of us, which is that this picture was taken well after he had been declared a war criminal by the tribunal to which I just alluded. He and his main henchman, a General Mladic, are still roaming around Europe, unlike Osama bin Laden, who appears, to the best of our knowledge, to be genuinely difficult to find and to bring to account. Karadzic and Mladic, it is generally known where they are. There was, of course, the extensive trial of Milosevic in The Hague, and yet these two people, these two men, these two war criminals are allowed to go free for reasons that are not incredibly clear. I end the book, Bad Leadership, with some lessons learned. I like to think that there is some practical application to staring into the eyes of bad leaders and bad followers, and I list some things that leaders can think of, what they can do to preclude themselves from evolving into bad leaders. But as important, and this is my sort of new thing, and my own belief is that there are reasons for a slight change in the balance of power between leaders and followers. So I think followers have more possibility to stop or slow bad leadership than they ever did before. And these are some things that followers can do. And I want to go back to the beginning. I want to close the circle before I stop speaking and go back to the start. At an absolute minimum, even though I have had only 30 or so minutes to talk to you, I hope I have persuaded you of the importance of looking at the dark side. I make a parallel to the field of leadership's refusal to look at bad leadership to the medical profession. I argue that it's as if a physician who is supposed to heal people was only taught about how to do the healing and not taught about pathology, not taught about the bad side. I think it's incredibly important to look at the pathology of leadership. There's no way we can cure it unless we're willing to see it. The 7 different types: incompetent, rigid, intemperate, callous, corrupt, insular, and evil, and ultimately the web of leadership, the web in which followers are as important as leaders and in which the context matters. So that's the formal talk on bad leadership. And let me just begin a couple of minutes of question and answer by asking you if in your studies to date the idea of bad leadership has come up in any way, shape, or form, and if so, which one? And then I invite you to ask questions or make comments. Has no one encountered bad leadership? It's very hard to believe. Yes? Talk louder. The Stanley Milgram experiment. How many of you are familiar with the Stanley Milgram experiment? Oh, a lot of you. Great. Well, I'm glad you raised that, although I would argue that's actually about bad followership. You know, what it is, that's less about a bad leader than it is, for those of you who don't know the experiment, it's where an experimenter gets people to give shocks to so-called learners in ways that people would never have thought was possible. The level of our capacity to inflict harm on others. How does it happen that that unfolds? So yes, that's one example, but as I said, I think of it a little bit more about bad followership. You know, what is it in us that allows us to do such bad things to so many people? So yes. Zimbardo's prison experiment, another one where seemingly ordinary people can be transformed into sadistic prison guards, our own capacity. By the way, on the larger question of what explains a leader's capacity to do dreadful things to other people, that is, to enlist bad followers, there are two really interesting books, particularly on Nazi Germany, and they take the diametrically opposed position. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's book on Hitler's willing executioners makes the argument that what happened in Nazi Germany was singular and could never happen anyplace else, at least not without the preparatory work. A book named Ordinary People by Christopher Browning takes just the opposite position, which is that we all have it in us to be as sadistic as were Nazi soldiers during World War II. So it's a different approach. Questions? Comments? Yes. You mean the contextual question? You mean how do we foster a context which encourages people to stop bad leadership or to preclude it from happening? To stop it from happening. Well, you know, when you say it's not, you know, how do you delve into something like that? None of these questions have incredibly easy answers. I think, you know, you could ask the question on an organizational level. How does a leader develop a context and a culture which encourages participation, which encourages people to speak up, which encourages people to say their mind and act accordingly? You know, bad leadership is often the result of fear and intimidation. So when you talk about context, presumably the context that is most amenable to stopping it is one in which there is no fear and intimidation. This is a cultural issue. You know, there are different cultures that encourage free speech, that encourage people to speak up when things go wrong. It's less an immediate contextual issue than it is a cultural issue. And the culture determines first the nature of the leadership and the followership, and then the level to which people are familiar with speaking up. I guess my basic argument is that bad leadership is endemic to the human condition. You used the term, we've been seeing it for several decades. As far as I'm concerned, it's as old as human history. It will continue to the end of human history. The question is, how do we change our behavior? And that's why I think it's so important to focus, to not be so leader-centric, to have a leadership studies that focuses as much on followers as it does on leaders, because it will not stop unless we ourselves recognize and use our own power to stop it. Otherwise, it will, whether it's corruption or evil or incompetence, unless we empower ourselves to do something about it, it will continue indefinitely. So it's really a change of mindset, and I think the field of leadership studies needs increasingly, as I suggested, to focus on that other side, on the side of the follower, and less on the leader. Yes? Yes. Can you tell what?
I come from Albania.
Yeah.
The communist regime fell, and we elected some leaders which were not the most appropriate people to lead the country. And often they were re-elected. I don't like to think that we're stupid, and I don't like to think that we cannot see evil. So I'm wondering if there's a larger, if there's some overarching factor that makes us elect these people, or if there's something that belongs to large crowds behaving, and the whole diffusion of responsibility that makes people elect these bad leaders. Because I don't like, it's uncomfortable to think that I'm one of them. I do not, and I'm not talking only that country-specific situation, but in general.
Right.
Why do we re-elect?
Yeah. I don't know if you all heard the question. It was posed by someone from Albania, and the question is, why do we keep on re-electing people who are not in our own best interest? I think that was essentially your question. There's, again, not a one-line answer. I'll give you a couple of answers. One is history. The history of a country has a lot to do with our capacity, with people's capacity to vote for people, especially if it's a free election, who are genuinely in their own best interest. As I suggested earlier, this is a culture and a mindset, and how do we get to the point where we're making the right decisions? Number two, even bad leaders provide us with some of the things that we want. It's really important to understand. Why did, when I described earlier Al Dunlap, and I said, what was it about this man that allowed people to just do what he said? Fear, intimidation, even all those downsides. You have security provided, whether it's a paycheck. You have safety provided. It's often very risky to go against a leader, especially if the culture doesn't support it. Risky in terms of losing your job, risky in terms of being marginalized, risky in terms sometimes of losing your life. So there are, when I say, gee, let's just all get together and stop this thing called bad leadership, I don't for a moment wish to underestimate the complexities involved. It's tough to get rid of bad leaders, and it's particularly tough to get rid of them once they are deeply entrenched. So this is not an easy task, and in particular not in countries such as Albania, which have a long history of oppression. Any final last questions on bad leadership? Every question, one final question. Yes? It seems more unifying than what? Well, to be it's not one person. It is a constellation of people. And the divide is, as I said, if you look at the universe of bad leadership, they do fall rather generally into one of these 7 categories. When you say unifying, the unifying theme is a human condition which allows followers to tolerate all kinds of bad leadership, very often without doing a great deal about it. So the unifying theme is the nature of the human condition. But the assignment to the different categories is done on the grounds of what was the kind of bad leadership that was most obviously manifested. So, okay, thank you very much.